Hello, everyone. My name is Giovanni Nogales, and I am a paralegal here at Laos Parker. Thank you for joining us for this new webinar series with the Home Care Association of Louisiana. Today's webinar is entitled ADRs, Prepayment Reviews, Postpayment Audits, and Suspensions. The impact of these administrative enforcement tools on home health and hospice agencies. Our presenters for today are Meaghan DeBenedetto and Christin Thompson. Meaghan is a senior associate at Laos Parker and is a certified professional coder. She has also had experience working for home health care agencies before attending law school. Meaghan has experience with auditing claims, identifying deficiencies, and assisting clients in improving their documentations. Meaghan also has extensive experience working on compliance plans and developing policies and procedures for a variety of different medical providers. As for Christin, she's also an associate at Laos Parker. Before joining Laos Parker, she worked as a professional coder, assigning diagnosis and procedural codes for urgent care, inpatient, and outpatient facilities. She has experience identifying documentation deficiencies and auditing claims for a variety of practice types. Christin assists providers nationwide with developing and implementing policies to improve documentation and coding practices. This is just a quick reminder. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will address as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And I will also be sending a PDF copy of the slides tomorrow. So without further ado, I present to you Meaghan DeBenedetto and Christin Thompson.
Thank you. All right, go to the next slide, please. This is just a quick disclaimer. This presentation is given for informational purposes only. Your situation may vary based on your individual facts and circumstances, and we recommend that you reach out to counsel if you have any specific questions or concerns about your situation. All right. So the first thing we're going to discuss are TPE audits. TPE audits, they were previously paused during COVID, but they have now resumed. As you can see on the slide, this is just some background on the history of TPE audits. They began in 2014 and have been evolving since that time. TPEs can be either prepayment or postpayment, and they involve MACs focusing on specific providers and suppliers that bill a particular item or service. I can go to the next slide. It's your MAC's job to review treatment documentation and cut down on improper payments. The MACs run the TPE, which is the Targeted Probe and Educate program, and they will select providers based on a number of different indicators, such as your billing patterns, your improper payment rates, etc. There are many different reasons you could be selected for this process. Once you are selected, the standard procedure is that 20 to 40 claims would be selected either per provider or per item of service. These would then be audited and you would receive corresponding education for any denials that you receive. There are some circumstances where more or less claims may be selected, but this is the standard process. So you can expect that if you get selected for the TPE process, you'll get 20 to 40 ADR requests specifically for those claims. The TPE process is in 3 different rounds, and you will be discontinued from the process whenever you're deemed compliant. Each MAC sets their own standard for what is considered to be compliant. Some of these are publicly stated on their website, or they will tell you if you call and ask. If you go through to the 3rd round and you're still not determined to be compliant, then you can be referred to CMS for further action. However, if you do meet the compliance standards at a previous round, then you would be discontinued and able to proceed steps outside of the ADR process then. When MACs are selecting who to audit, they typically are looking for outliers. This is commonly done by data mining. They're looking for things such as a high volume of services, high cost, dramatic change in frequency or use, a big change year over year. This could be either going up or down in use of services, or really any change or statistic that makes you different from other providers in your area or in your specialty. Like I said, so the data mining looks to see how you compare to your peers, and then if there's anything that makes you different, then you could be selected. However, it's not recommended that you try to avoid the TPE process by changing your services. You should perform the services that are medically reasonable and necessary based on the patients in front of you. That could mean that you have a specialty. For instance, in home care, it might be that you have more physical therapy than other providers in your area because that is the type of referrals that you receive. So if you get a large number of referrals for patients that need physical therapy, then you should perform the physical therapy that is needed. Yes, that could make you more likely to be selected for auditing in general, but trying to avoid auditing by trying to match some kind of statistic that you don't even have access to would be impossible, and it could result in you performing services that, or not providing services that a patient actually needs. So while data mining is the cause of most auditing, it's not really something that you can avoid by trying to match other people. The better process would be to making sure that your documentation meets the standards and that all of your services are medically reasonable and necessary, as opposed to worrying about the data mining. You can also be referred to the TPE process, though, referred to the MAC to go through this. These referrals could come from a RAC or a UPIC or OIG, for example. This could be from having issues with previous audits or repeated billing patterns found, or it could be like OIG cleared you from their own internal investigation, but then believe that you still have some issues, and then they refer you over there to go through this targeted probe and educate process. MACs tend to target providers with historically high claim denial rates. They have billing practices that vary from their peers, or where there is evidence that there is potential risk to the Medicare Trust Fund. If you're selected for the TPE process, you'll receive a letter stating that you've been selected for review. The letter explains the TPE process, what you can expect, and then also discusses the one-on-one education you're entitled to as part of this process. The letter will also discuss how the MAC has the option to refer providers to a RAC or a UPIC if the provider fails to respond to the ADRs that are received. You'll receive ADRs, which are additional document requests for each claim selected as part of the TPE process. These are separate letters that will be received until the identified number of claims have been sampled. So, for instance, there'll typically be 20 to 40 claims. You'll receive 20 to 40 individual letters asking for additional documentation. For the first round of TPE, claims will be selected based on claim submission date. After that, claims in subsequent rounds are selected based on the dates of service. This is because they want to ensure that you have time to implement the education they provide in your documentation. If they based it on your claim submission date, then it could be for older claims that weren't benefited by the additional education that they provided after the previous round. And so they do try to allow you to implement and improve in response to the TPE process. That the educate part is a big part of this process, where they want you to improve and show that you are compliant with the Medicare rules. There's specific notification language that has to be included. This is on the slide. Specifically, the second bullet point, though, is critical. It states, in particular, we note that per 42 CFR, CMS has the authority to revoke a currently enrolled provider's Medicare billing privileges if CMS determines that the provider has a pattern or practice of submitting claims that fail to meet Medicare requirements. This discusses the authority that they have to revoke your Medicare billing privileges if CMS determines that the provider does have a pattern or practice of submitting bad claims. So if you have a high error rate, they can revoke you. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about the revocation process today, but you should be aware that suspensions or revocations are risks for anything that involves high error rates, and if you fail or don't respond to any of these audits. Things that may result in revocation are repetitive errors, which is another reason why it's so important to keep up with your compliance practices and have a robust compliance plan in place. And that is enforced to ensure that all denials are addressed and that you don't continue to have the same issues to avoid such consequences as revocation. When you receive an ADR request, you should gather the request records just like any other audit. it's very important that you go through and check your documentation for completeness and accuracy prior to submission. You should ensure that all required documents are included based on the types of claims requested. This is very important as the types of documents to be submitted will vary, but some MACs have listed helpful guides on their websites, and some of these documents that they're requesting are not what you might expect. Sometimes they might ask for additional episodes of care, either before or after the episode being audited, or specific other types of documentation. So it's just very important that you review and understand exactly what they're asking for. You should also carefully review the letter received because sometimes additional information may be requested that you're not expecting. This could be specific questions about your company or about your providers, and you want to make sure that anything that they have concerns about is addressed. It's also very important that you comply with all of the stated deadlines. As you'll be receiving 20 to 40 individual letters, each claim will have a different due date. So it's recommended that you create a spreadsheet or some other type of tracking method that works for you to ensure that no deadlines are missed. Again, because there's so many different moving deadlines as part of the TPE process, this can be very difficult to keep track of. You might receive a large chunk of the letters at the same time, but sometimes they can be spent, weeks apart, and it can be difficult to know when the deadlines are. Failure to submit records is one of the most common denials, and it can result in a referral to a UPIC audit, which could then be extrapolated and result in massive overpayments being assessed. Now, if you miss one letter out of 40, it's not likely that they're going to refer you to a UPIC for that reason, but you might get a denial for a service that you truly did perform and that met the requirements just for something simple as a mistake of not turning in records. And then that denial could result in you not moving out of or being considered passing this round. And so it's very important that you don't miss an opportunity to submit records and potentially open yourself up to more problems just for a simple mistake. When you submit your documentation, the MAC does a medical review to identify any concerns. And if they identify an easily curable error, the MAC is supposed to contact you to address the error and allow you to submit missing documentation. This could be like an unsigned note that could be easily cured with a signature attestation. However, not all signatures can be cured. For example, an unsigned 485 cannot be cured by an attestation, as that must be signed prior to billing as a condition of payment. So some signatures, though, that can be cured are sometimes on a note or things of that nature. If the provider forgot to sign, they can still sign after the fact with the signature attestation. All things that are added after the fact have to be clearly marked as addendums, though. It can't be pretending to have been done at the time of service. It needs to be clear, and it needs to be dated and signed, and that it's marked as the addendum. If a provider failed to submit some notes, those issues can also easily be cured with a supplement or addressed in an appeal, so you could turn in those notes then. So just because you failed to submit a specific document in a first round, it's okay. It can be submitted on appeal. However, keep in mind that the appeals do not necessarily help you in the TPE process, as the appeals do not have to be considered as reducing your error rate, even if you win those appeals. This is because the appeals process can take months, and often you will have already moved on to the next round of the TPE process before you get a chance to resolve all of the appeals. If the appeals are processed quickly enough or the rounds are delayed, it's possible that your appeals can reduce your denial rate and move you out of the TPE process, but it's up to your MAC and not a guarantee that they will do this. We do know of at least one MAC who put the second round on hold and would not process additional audits until after the results of their appeals were received, but this was an unusual circumstance, and it's definitely to the provider's benefit if they do it, but there's no guarantees. Again, this is definitely to your benefit if they will hold your TPE process. So if possible, it might be something worth talking to your MAC to see if they'll let you continue out the appeals process before moving you forward. Because if you pass the appeals and improves your error rate, it might move you entirely out of the TPE process without ever having to move on to the second or third round. But again, it's not the standard and not something you should expect, but it is a possibility, something to keep in mind if you are to get your appeals filed quickly. TPEs are typically returned to you within 30 days for prepayment claims and 60 days for post-payment reviews. These are just averages though, and they can vary widely based on the actual timelines of the TPE reviews. The TPE reviews are also supposed to be conducted by qualified individuals such as registered nurses, certified coders. This means that they should have some qualifications before reviewing your documentation, but does not mean that your results will make sense. Recently, for example, we had a dental audit that was conducted by nurses with no dental experience. So just because someone is in medical doesn't mean that they necessarily have experience in your area of practice or that they will understand your documentation. There's some very interesting results that have been issued by some of the MACs. So it's always good to keep in mind, don't just assume that they're correct about what the rules are. And those are things that can be pushed back on in the auditing process to explain, that something is not a requirement, or that one of these issues that they're pointing out just isn't actually real for your area. This is often a bean counting experience when they're going through and auditing. They have a checklist and they're just checking for each item. They're not just common sense arguments that the care was necessarily good or bad, or that the patient improved. They're checking to just make sure that each and every single box is checked. So this is why it's very important that on an ongoing basis, you're reviewing your documentation, you're reviewing each clinician's documentation, and making sure that they understand what needs to be documented and that that documentation is reflecting the services actually provided. Because while it's great that your patients might be receiving fantastic care, if your documentation doesn't reflect that care that's provided, you oftentimes will not pass if you're ever audited. So this is a depiction of the TPE audit process. We've already gone over a bit, but this is how the TPE process proceeds. You first get a letter saying you were selected for the TPE process. Then you get told the 20 to 40 claims to be reviewed. Again, this will be typically separate letters that are sent to you over a period of time. You go through the medical review process for those claims. If those claims are denied, you get invited to a one-on-one education session. It's very important that you attend the provided education. Some providers will decline this, thinking that they know the rules or that they won't benefit from any education. But it's very important that you attend and take advantage of it to really understand why the claims were denied. You are allowed and should ask questions. You are meeting directly with the reviewers who will be overseeing your audit throughout this process. So this is your best chance to really see how the MAC interprets the rules. As you know, there can be some disagreement about what requirements actually mean. So hearing what the MAC believes will tell you what you need to do. Regardless of if the MAC is right or wrong, the quickest way to get claims approved is to abide typically by their interpretation, as long as it's somewhat reasonable, because that tells you what they will enforce. After education, you're given at least 45 days to make changes and improvements. This sometimes is extended. For instance, we've had clients that it's taken up to a year between TPE rounds, but you cannot count on having extra time. Oftentimes providers who get additional time think that their audit has been forgotten, or that this is all over. And that's not usually the case. They don't normally forget about you. If you move to the second or third round, they're going to come back at some point and do it. It just might be delayed for whatever reason. If you get extra time, though, that should just be viewed as a good opportunity for you to continue to improve in making sure that your documentation will pass the next levels. You need to work swiftly after the education session to update your practices to ensure that you'll pass these later rounds. After the waiting period, 20 to 40 new claims will be selected to go through the whole process again. You'll get education again, and then at least 45 days to implement the changes before moving into round 3 if you continue to move through the process. And again, you'll move to round 3 if you continue to get denied. At any time, you could be determined to be compliant and removed from the process. But if after round 3 you're found to not be compliant still, you'll be referred out for other CMS action. If found to be compliant, you will not be reviewed again for at least 1 year on the selected topic. You can have multiple TPEs covering different types of claims through this, so covering different types of claims, though at the same time or one after the other. So just because you finished one set of claims doesn't mean that you're not going to be audited again, because there's other types of services. You can also still be audited by a UPIC or RAC or other contractors. So it's not just the TPE process. Of course, there's plenty of other Medicare reviewers out there that could step in and audit you for even the same types of issues. It just means that the narrow issues specifically covered, though, by this TPE wouldn't be audited again for 1 year, with the caveat that if your billing practices significantly change, they could audit you again even within the 1 year time frame. So if you just wait till after the TPE and then you significantly change your billing practices again, even though they already audited that issue, they could just come back and audit it again. This flowchart also depicts some of the information we were just discussing. It shows how if you make it through the rounds when you get out of the TPE process, or where you go on for possible further action, you really do not want to get to round 3. If you fail round 1, it happens. You get education and you modify your practices. This happens a lot, but then your goal really needs to be to put everything into passing round 2. You really don't want to get to round 3, because the risks associated with failing this round are potentially devastating. You could be sent on to any number of further actions, such as a UPIC audit, which has the risk of an extrapolated audit, suspension, or revocation. These can shut your agency down, as they're some of the highest risk areas providers can face. And therefore, you really need to engage with this process and the education to avoid failing round 3 and facing further action. But if you do move into round 3, do not freak out. You just need to ensure that you fully took advantage of the education of the previous 2 rounds and make appropriate changes to ensure you pass the final round. And it should also be noted that at any point in time, they could also refer you on to further action if your documentation or your practices are so far out of compliance that they don't view the education as being beneficial, or they view you as actually fraudulent. So while the biggest risk is to make it to round 3 and of course fail that, at any other point, if you're having severe issues, you could be referred out regardless. So here are some of the top denial reasons for the TPE process, especially for home health or hospice agencies. The number 1 denial reason we see is missing or inadequate face-to-face documentation. Face-to-face requirements have changed over the years, but there's been a requirement for a very long time at this point, and it still remains a major issue for agencies. It is required that the actual notes of the encounter be collected from the physician, and the primary reason for the services be documented at that encounter. Another common issue is the face-to-face not being performed by the certifying physician. There are some exceptions, such as when they're coming from an acute care or mid-levels working under the supervision, but these arrangements need to be documented. The certifying physician must have reviewed the face-to-face still. Another issue is failing to document the date the face-to-face occurred in the physician certification. It's recommended that the date of the face-to-face be incorporated in your 485 to ensure that this requirement is met. We find that often this box is left blank even when people have included it though, which is resulting in a ton of denials that we've seen. You should be conducting regular internal audits and reviews of your face-to-face documentation and certification documents to ensure that all requirements are being met due to the high risk associated with these documents and the fact that these issues cannot be rectified after the services have been billed. So if you have an issue with your face-to-face documentation, there's nothing that can be done at that point to fix most of these issues. So that's why this one is worth auditing on an ongoing basis to ensure that you're not having additional issues. After you complete each round, you get offered one-on-one education with the auditor. This can be completed via phone call or over a webinar platform, and very rarely it's done in person. It should be noted, though, that if you call the MAC after you've received your results, sometimes they'll do something that's like an informal discussion with you, and then they write that down as having been your formal education. So you need to be clear that if you're calling, that the discussion you're having is not considered your education until you're fully prepared for that discussion. You want to make sure you fully read your results, have a list of all of your questions, and have all people you wish to be present there and able to engage in the education. We've had clients call the auditor and just have a quick 10-minute call, and then the auditor stated they'd already received their education and refused to engage with them anymore. So it's very important that you push back on this and ensure that you're actually getting all of your questions answered and that you're fully engaged in the educational process. These calls are genuinely for your education. So if the reviewer is going too quickly, or if they're using language you're unfamiliar with, you need to slow them down and ask them to repeat themselves, explain more, or whatever you need to make sure that you truly understand what they're asking for and why. Education should be individualized, it should be claim specific, and it should be conducted in a format that is interactive. So the provider should be able to engage and ask questions of the reviewer. Anyone can be on the call with you, so you want to have critical members of your organization participate who are in charge of compliance to make sure that they have their questions asked and addressed and that they understand what it is that they need. This can include your biller or your legal representative. If you're told something is denied for a reason you're not familiar with, you can ask for the regulation or rules so that you can review it and ensure that you understand. You can ask questions about the actual claims that were reviewed in the audit, so you can use actual details to ensure you understand what they're saying and why that claim was denied, so you can fix those issues for later rounds. You'll then receive your results letter. This will say why the claims are denied, including the specific errors. You'll be given or can calculate your error rate at that time. It will also include details on how to appeal any denied claims. There are strict deadlines associated with appealing denials to be complied with. These deadlines for recoupment will be earlier than the deadline to appeal the denial, so be sure that you carefully review all letters, including demand letters received, to avoid any surprises. You should also appeal any denials that you believe were wrongly decided, because this will reduce your overall denials and potentially your error rate if they wait to go on to later rounds. So it's highly recommended, though, that you appeal any denials, because even if it doesn't affect going on to later rounds, it will affect when they look back at your error rate. You can be referred to CMS at the max discretion after 3 rounds of the TPE process. However, as I already mentioned, you can also be referred to your UPIC or to a UPIC at any time. They don't have to wait for you to complete the 3 rounds. So, anything very concerning, or they suspect fraud, or any reason that they believe that the UPIC should be brought in, they may choose to send you there at that time. The UPIC will often do an audit of a statistically valid random sample. That allows them to extrapolate, which results in overpayments and sometimes hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And the extrapolation would be based on the total amount you've received for those services over a period, typically 3 years. This is why we recommend that you hire external assistance during the TPE process. It is in the interest of all parties to have assistance from the beginning, as it will help you with your ability to lower your denial rates and hopefully exit the process prior to a later round or referral to additional audits. If you refuse education, going back to our previous slide, you also could be referred out for that refusal. In addition to that, regardless of if you're referred out for the refusal, if they refer you out at the end of your 3rd round, they will have noted that you've refused education, and that is used when determining any future actions taken against you, because the refusal suggests that you are not willing to update or make necessary changes, and it could make negative inferences about your agency. So it's very important that you do not refuse any of the education offered. If you have a sufficiently low error rate, you can be removed from the TPE process after any of the rounds. After the TPE process, the MACs continue to use data analysis to monitor your billing practices, though. And if the billing practices change or revert back to what they were before the audit, they'll be noted and can result in resumption of TPEs or further action. So for instance, if they educate you that you're using a code incorrectly, and then you update your billing practices, and then immediately after being removed from the TPE practice, you go right back to what you were doing, that could cause another audit. Your error rate can be calculated a few different ways. It can be based on the dollars denied versus dollars that would have been reimbursed if the claim was paid. It can be based on the specific number of claims denied, or some mix of these processes. Your MAC will choose how they're calculating your denial rates, and they also determine what the acceptable denial rate will be to get out of the TPE process. So keep in mind that the denial rate can vary based on your jurisdiction. Sometimes it's 20% denial rate, for instance, but it will come up to your individual MAC what their rules are. These are some examples of at least what they've said in the past of what their error rate thresholds are. These may have changed, but were reflected during previous cases we have worked on. For example, Palmetto, if you had less than a 20% error rate, you'd be removed from the TPE process. But if you hit 21%, you would continue to the next round. And so that also points out the importance of really going after each and every single claim and not allowing any to be denied or forgetting to turn in documentation, because 1 percentage point could mean the difference between additional audits or not. These are some compliance tips. We recommend that you find your MAC TPE webpage, and then you can review topics, dates, documentation checklists, and education information that they provide. We recommend that you do this now and not wait till you have a problem. Make sure that your point of contact is correct and up to date in PCOS. They'll use this to contact you so you can miss vital communications if it has not been updated. We see this happen all the time where some former employee or some email address is put on that is not regularly checked, and it can result in denials because you failed to meet deadlines or respond. We recommend that you conduct an internal review of records before you submit them. If you get a TPE process, you check for additional documentation, you see if anything needs to be supplemented, and then you collect whatever else is needed. And of course, even once you've turned in your records, you supplement if you determine that there are documents that are missing. You need to respond within the notice letter's time frame. You should be tracking your ADRs via spreadsheet or some other method to avoid missing any due days. You should participate in your education, as they keep stating, do not refuse your education. Make sure that everyone who needs it receives the education and makes the necessary changes. You may need to gather all of your staff to make sure the updates are timely communicated because of the tight timelines as well. So just be very careful following your education timeline. Then you need to identify any changes to your policies, procedures, and documentation that are needed and make those changes as necessary. ADRs are part of the TPE process because you receive additional document requests for the 20 to 40 records. However, they're also a separate audit process that can occur at the same time or completely separately from the TPEs as well. A plain ADR is less risk because it's just one claim and not part of an audit system. However, ADRs can result in referral for further auditing, so they should still be taken seriously each time they're received. TPEs review more claims and therefore are higher risk. As a reminder, you can be in multiple TPE processes at the same time, and you can receive multiple ADRs at the same time and can receive both at any time as well. So you could have many different types of audits going on at the same time, or types of audits, and these can all have overlapping elements. Christin's now going to take over and talk further about the risk of ADRs and that process.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, so additional document requests, or ADRs, are part of Medicare's overall medical review program. Authority to request additional documentation can be found in various sections of the Social Security Act, like sections 1883E and 1815A. The most important thing to understand is that a MAC has the authority to review any claims at any time. As a Medicare participating provider, the cost of doing business is that you're going to get audited. It's not a matter of if you're going to avoid it, it's a matter of when and whether you're ready when the time comes. Next slide. So ADRs are done prior to payment of a claim and are usually handled by the MAC. Although some can come from other contractors, there are various reasons that providers receive ADRs. An element of a claim might need a prepayment edit. It could be a national edit. There could be a specific national review program focusing on a specific ICD-10 or CPT codes. We're seeing a lot of these program-focused ADRs right now. It could also be a provider-specific edit based on reasons or edits developed by the MAC's internal medical review or program integrity unit. All prepayment edits can key in on a beneficiary's HICN, a provider's NPI, a service date, CPT or HCPCS codes, and ICD-10 codes, among other data points. So you may not know exactly why they're looking at you. They may have a specific project for any of those reasons. Next slide. MACs must be able to review a claim in an apples-to-apples manner. For example, the standards of one procedure, diagnosis, or place of service cannot be used to determine the appropriateness of another. This is particularly tricky when reviewers are assessing a family of codes, and special attention should be paid to the similarities and differences for distinguishing codes within a family. Time-based codes should really have clear indications of start and stop times. If you are doing procedures that are size-based, really documenting those sizes, that level of specificity, which is different for our home health clients, but we want to make sure that you understand what the apples to apples is going to look like. Next slide. For ADRs, you're going to receive a letter sent to the address on file in PECOS. You need to make sure that this address is current. An ADR has a 30-day response deadline. So if your address isn't current, just like Meaghan was saying, then you can run into issues where you're not able to find things in a timely manner. One MAC states documentation received after the 30-day deadline may not be completed within the 45-day review window. And if a provider fails to respond by day 40, the claim can automatically be denied. What I'm seeing currently are ADR denials stemming from no records received because the ADR isn't being mailed. It's popping up in the MAC's online portal. So I encourage you to set up your account within the portal and make sure you're checking it regularly for documentation and notice letters that may be coming through in that fashion that you might not be aware of, especially because the timeline is critical. One of the major denial reasons related to ADRs is that documentation isn't received. It's hard to believe that a provider wouldn't respond to an ADR that they'd received. It could be the quick timelines are the problem, along with gathering the requested records and submitting them. Certainly a problem if things are popping up in the portal and not in your mailbox. It is really important to be aware of those deadlines, like Meaghan was discussing with the TPEs, and to make sure you're getting the documents submitted in time. You can always supplement, which is important, as long as you make sure that you put your ADR cover letter on those supplements and make sure it's fairly clear to the contractor that you're submitting these as supplements. Next slide. So this is a quick visual of submitting the ADR. You're going to send each ADR packet separately. The ADR cover letter should always be included and put on the top of your record. It can be helpful to submit the documentation through the electronic portal since it will get there instantly. The processing times are faster, you get the results faster, and then you get paid faster to the extent your claim is determined to be payable. I'm old-fashioned. I send everything by mail, and I always send it with tracking. And I always keep a copy of exactly what I sent. If your preference on whether you use it's your preference on whether you use the electronic portal or mail in your response. In either case, always keep a copy of your record. Many providers don't do that, and when a claim gets denied, they bring us on board and are unable to provide an exact copy of the files submitted to the MAC. A lot of times they'll offer to repull from the EMR, but we can't be sure that's exactly what was sent to the MAC. As a result, we don't know with certainty what the MAC is looking at. So it's really, really important to keep a copy of those records on file that you've submitted in response to an ADR. If the MAC overlooks something, we can say we have a copy of the record, we have the page numbers, and we can point them to the specific spot in the submitted file. The reviewer could say a record is unsigned, but we can point to the physician's signature on a specific page, for example, and that's a quick way to correct a wrong assessment on the part of the reviewer and get an easy win. Be sure to pick up the phone and call the MAC with any questions. They do have a provider education department and provider resource line. So it's always worth asking, particularly if you've identified a mistake and it's something that's easily correctable. Next slide. What's the difference between receiving an ADR and being placed on prepayment review? ADRs are typically initiated by a MAC, by a provider's MAC, and they typically relate to a particular probe or edit conducted by the MAC. They can be focused on specific services, lengths of stay, a provider-specific diagnosis, or other reasons. In contrast to an ADR, being placed on prepayment review is usually going to affect 100% of your claims, and it can last a year or more. It's an intensive process, and rarely less than 100% of your claims are going to go through the review. It's going to affect your revenue stream. And sometimes dramatically so. Next slide. For prepayment reviews, UPICs will typically send notice to the provider if they're selected for review. However, we've seen quite a number of providers who've never gotten a notice before and who've just started receiving requests for documentation, which can be alarming. There is a provision in the Medicare Program Integrity Manual that says they should provide notice, and you should push back and make sure you get that documentation if you have not received it before you start receiving requests for documentation. Private payers are increasingly placing providers on prepayment review, and unlike Medicare and other government payers, very few private payers payer contracts go into very much detail on their processes. When it comes to how the provider may be placed on prepayment review, they also typically don't address the scope of a prepayment review. So it could be very uncharted territory to get into that kind of a review with a private contractor. From a practical standpoint, the payments can be delayed up to 6 months or more. So we want to make sure that where possible, we don't jeopardize that revenue stream. Next slide. With an audit, with any audit, our advice is always the same. Never ignore the problem and review the claims and associated documentation before you send them in. There are many of the things that we pointed out before. Make sure medical necessity is substantiated. Make sure the services billed are documented. Make sure the documentation complies with your LCDs and national coverage determinations. If they don't, if there are missing elements, go to the provider to prepare an addendum in line with the Medicare record keeping principles. We want to make sure that we fill in those gaps whenever possible. Make sure the records are for the right patient. I mean, it's a quick thing to check, but make sure. Clearly marking these addendums made by your providers, not altering their original documentation, is crucial. Making sure they're signed off with the date that the addendum or correction is made is critical to making sure that these things are accepted. If your providers are doing all of that, they are able to make the addendum to their documentation to clarify, to correct, or to elaborate. It's important to take advantage of the initial review of documentation that you're doing before you submit this to the MAC, and it becomes a part of the administrative record. You also want to check whether claims are coded, billed, and paid correctly. We think so much about documentation being the patient's narrative, but we also want to make sure that the back end affecting payment is also reviewed. Next slide. So what is a post-payment review? A post-payment audit occurs after a provider has submitted a claim to receive payment. Basically, they're looking at claims that have already been paid. To the extent there are any issues determined, for example, eligibility requirements weren't met or the claim isn't supported, they would then ask for that money back through a demand letter. There are a lot of different sources for post-payment review. We're seeing data mining, and of course, contractors can basically look at the data however they want, which makes it easier for providers to get selected for that post-payment review. Some of the things they might see when they're looking at that information: are you billing more than your peers? Did you have a change in your reimbursement last year to this year? There are so many different ways they can look at it, and it's really one of the big reasons that providers get targeted for post-payment review. You can be placed in post-payment review because of complaints or referrals as well, but we're seeing those less frequently. When you get a post-payment review notice, one of the first things we do in our firm is that we file a Freedom of Information Act request. We want to know what's going on. Where did the source come from? Was it a referral? Was it a complaint? Or, was it more common, the more common reason? Is it a data mining source? It takes a long time to get that information back, but eventually we do get it, and it can be very, very helpful in narrowing or identifying what the scope of the review is. Sometimes we get some very specific details from the contractor's investigative file, and sometimes we don't. But it's worth submitting those FOIA requests at the beginning of a post-payment review. Next slide. There are several big concerns with post-payment reviews. The money has already been paid and used for overhead and salaries, and now the payer is asking to get that money back. Getting the money together when it's demanded from the provider can be extremely difficult. Post-payment audits are sometimes extrapolated. When overpayments are extrapolated, you may be talking about a lot more than just the sample of claims that's been submitted, depending on the error rate and the universe of claims. We see too often several thousands of dollars quickly become hundreds of thousands of dollars or more. There are also oftentimes lots of errors are identified per claim, each of which must be reversed. So when you go through the appeals process, you might be able to win the face-to-face issue, but then you still have to prove the medical necessity denial. The more denials you have, the harder it is to win them because you're trying to defend multiple aspects of the claim. Medicare can deny your claim for any number of reasons. In order for you to get paid, you have to win on every single denial that they bring to the table. So you may have, let's just say, 5 denial reasons for a claim, and you clear 4 of them at your redetermination level appeal. Well, that claim is still going to remain unpaid, but you may get it overturned and it may be payable at the reconsideration level. So just because you haven't reached the point of payment at your first or even your second level of appeal doesn't mean you necessarily won't reach that at the following level. Next slide. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the CMS appeals statistics. It's always important to look at these. The last year we have is going to be fiscal year of 2020. One of the main points is it's better to get this all sorted out in the medical review process, respond with solid documentation, and get your claim paid, because going through the appeal process is long and time consuming, and also you might not win. If you look at 2012 and then at 2020, those numbers have dropped dramatically for fully favorable and partially favorable. You don't want to get into the appeals process. It's incredibly long. You have multiple levels of review, and each of those takes months to complete. And I also want to say, don't be discouraged. The first level of appeal comes back and it's not as favorable as you would have hoped. We're seeing less movement by the MACs at redetermination than we are by the qualified independent contractors at the reconsideration level. Next slide. What is a suspension? Suspensions are terrible. Your revenue stops, and it's going to stop very likely for a minimum of 180 days. Sometimes suspensions are extended when the contractor hasn't completed their investigation, and that can double the length of the suspension to a whole year. You might be getting paid for claims, but that money's held in escrow until that investigation is completed. So even though claims are going through, you're not getting any of those funds. When your payer mix is heavily Medicare, this is a huge amount of your reimbursement and can be debilitating if you're not getting paid. There are several different reasons that a provider can be placed on suspension. One of the most common that we see is credible allegations of fraud. Next slide. So what is a credible allegation of fraud? Unfortunately for providers, the barrier to establish this for CMS is extremely low. It could be based on a probe audit. They'll tell you that the medical review results for the probe audit weren't satisfactory. It could be a hotline complaint, more of the data mining. It could be from a law enforcement investigation. When you receive your suspension notice, the letter generally references 5 claims and will note the documentation didn't support that the services were medically necessary. This can be their credible allegation of fraud, and you're suspended for 180 days. They don't have to tell you anything about their actual analysis or how they applied the Medicare coverage criteria in your rebuttal. You could take that opportunity to respond to those 5 claims that they identify, but again, we often see that the investigation that's occurring during suspension is going to take the full 180 days in terms of knowing whether you're suspended or it's going to be lifted. You're going to get a notice letter, but they usually send it on the day or the day before the suspension actually occurs. So you don't really have notice. Basically, on June 24th or 25th today, they issued the letter, and on June 26th, tomorrow, you receive the letter and find that you were suspended the 25th. Next slide. As I mentioned, after receiving notice of the suspension, you do have the opportunity to submit a rebuttal. We always recommend submitting one, even though it doesn't often result in the reversal of the suspension because it's part of your defense. They're giving you some of the allegations, even though those are generic and they're only related to 5 claims. It's your opportunity to respond to them to collect and submit additional documentation. Sometimes they say we interviewed beneficiaries who tell them they didn't receive the services. You could potentially go back and ask those beneficiaries to sign affidavits. If they agree that they received the services, you can do things to begin to develop your defense. When they finally release you from suspension and you go through the appeals process, you have the best documentation you can and you're ready to support those services. One of the things to remember about a suspension when your payments are being placed in escrow, at the end of that suspension period, should you be undergoing any audits and an overpayment is determined, those escrow payments will be released to satisfy those overpayments first, and any remaining money will be released to the agency. So there is a possibility that release from suspension will not result in receipt of 100% of those funds that were held in escrow. Next slide. Some conclusions here. The potential results of a bad audit can be increased likelihood of post-payment reviews, overpayments, repayments, cash flow shortages. It would lead to suspension of your Medicare payments. We know how difficult that can be. And then also could lead to revocation, which is an entirely different administrative process that takes an entire hour to discuss. Things you can do to minimize impact of these types of audit and suspension mechanisms is to start compliance now. If your practice receives any kind of notice of prepayment, post-payment review, or suspension, get legal counsel involved immediately. The sooner you do, the sooner the providers get back to business as normal. You really need someone who knows these processes and knows what it takes to go through the audits or the suspension as fast as possible. More than anything else, never ignore a notice from Medicare. It won't go away, and it's a basis for them to escalate to more severe administrative actions later. So it goes back to don't ignore these audits. I think I left enough time for any questions that we may have. So next slide. We want to thank you for having us today, and we're happy to answer any of those questions that may have come up.
As is right now, we do not have any questions. So I guess I'll just close out. Thank you so much to our presenter, Christin and Meaghan, for that information. And thank you to our attendees for joining us today. I'll be sending a copy again for the PowerPoint slides tomorrow. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Christin or Meaghan, as you can see in the PowerPoint slide. Have a great Tuesday, guys.